the opulence of the room seemed to suffocate the air itself. The mansion, a sprawling testament to wealth, glimmered under the weight of chandeliers and polished marble. At the head of the table sat the millionaire, a man whose every move was calculated, precise. His face, hard and sharp like the cold steel of a blade, was expressionless as he stared at his only daughter. She stood before him, silent but defiant, her gaze unwavering despite the weight of his authority. His decision had been made, and nothing would change it. She was to marry a humble farmer. This, he believed, would be the ultimate blow to her rebellion. For years, he had struggled to control her. Despite his wealth, his power, and the countless privileges she had been afforded, she had always been difficult, too independent, too unwilling to bend to his will. She had grown up in the lap of luxury, never knowing hardship, and yet she refused to live by the rules he had set for her. Today, that would change. He would strip her of everything she valued, the comfort, the luxury, and the freedom she had taken for granted. In his mind, marrying her off to a farmer would be the perfect way to humble her. He expected an outburst. Tears, maybe, or at the very least, a protest. Yet, to his surprise, she did not flinch. Her expression remained neutral, her eyes betraying no fear, no anger. It was as if she had anticipated this. The silence in the room stretched on, and the millionaire felt a flicker of doubt. But he quickly dismissed it. She was young, naive. She had no idea what life on a farm would entail. Once she realized the harshness of her new reality, she would surely break. He was certain of it. His voice was cold and emotionless as he laid out the details. The wedding would be quick, and she would leave for the countryside immediately after. There would be no return to the life she knew. She would live in a modest home, with no servants, no luxuries. The farmer was a good man, hardworking and honest, but in the millionaire's eyes, he was beneath them, beneath her. This was no match made out of love, it was a punishment, one he was sure would teach her the lesson she desperately needed to learn. Still, his daughter said nothing. Her silence was unnerving, almost infuriating. The tension in the room thickened as her calm demeanor began to chip away at his confidence. Why wasn't she fighting back? He had expected defiance, an argument, anything but this airy acceptance. Her composure unsettled him, though he refused to show it. He had to maintain control, to assert his authority, but a seed of doubt had been planted, growing slowly in the back of his mind. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging his decree, and turned to leave the room. For the first time, the millionaire felt a crack in his plan. Was she really going to go through with this so easily? He watched her as she walked out, her back straight, her steps purposeful. It was as if she had already made peace with his decision. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving him alone in the vast room. For a moment, he stood there, his mind racing. What had just happened? His plan had been to break her spirit, to force her into submission. And yet, as the evening shadows crept into the room, he realized that she had not broken at all. In fact, she seemed stronger, more resolute than ever. A chill ran down his spine as he considered the possibility that perhaps, in trying to punish her, he had only given her what she wanted, a way out. But how could that be? She had everything here, wealth, comfort, security. What could a simple farmer offer her that he could not? He tried to shake off the unsettling thoughts. No, she would realize her mistake soon enough. Life on a farm was no fairy tale. It was hard work, endless labor, and dirt, nothing like the world she had known. She would come crawling back, begging for her old life. And when she did, he would be there, waiting, ready to take her back under his terms. He was certain of it. He had always been right in the past. Why should this time be any different? As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the estate, the millionaire felt a strange unease settling in his chest. He stood by the window, watching the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back. His daughter's calm, almost serene acceptance of her fate gnawed at him, but he refused to dwell on it. Tomorrow, she would be gone, and his life would return to its orderly, predictable routine. Or so he hoped. Yet, as the last light of day faded into night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The balance of power between them had tilted, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he was in control. What if she didn't break? What if, instead, she thrived in the very life he had intended to use as her punishment? That thought, more than anything, kept him awake long into the night. The day of the wedding arrived sooner than anyone had anticipated. The ceremony, a far cry from the grand affairs expected of someone of her status, was simple and modest. Held in a small rural chapel, the guests were few, and the decorations were plain. Yet, the daughter stood there, dressed in a humble gown, radiating an air of calm that no one could quite understand. Her father, expecting tears or last-minute resistance, was met instead with a serene resolve. She said her vows without hesitation, her voice steady and clear, as if she had accepted her fate long before this day. To the surprise of all present, there was no defiance, no rebellion in her eyes. Instead, she seemed almost peaceful. The small crowd of onlookers, mostly curious villagers and a few distant relatives, whispered among themselves, wondering how she could face such a future without a trace of fear. Her new husband, the farmer, stood beside her, a man of few words, but with a quiet strength that seemed to match her own. Together, they looked like a picture of calm acceptance, a stark contrast to the turmoil that surely swirled in the millionaire's heart. As the ceremony concluded, the daughter took her new husband's arm and walked out of the chapel without a backward glance. There were no tears, no second thoughts. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had made a choice, not been forced into one. This baffled everyone, especially her father, who watched from the shadows, his pride still stinging from her lack of resistance. He had expected humiliation, but what he witnessed instead was far more disconcerting, a quiet defiance that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. The days following the wedding were filled with speculation. The millionaire's friends and business associates couldn't believe what had transpired. They had all expected his daughter to rebel, to refuse the life that had been thrust upon her. But instead, she seemed to embrace it. Whispers spread through the elite circles, questioning what her true intentions were. Surely, they thought, this was a temporary show of compliance. Surely, she would crumble once the reality of her new life set in. Yet, each passing day seemed to strengthen the mystery surrounding her actions. Even her father, despite his determination to believe otherwise, began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. He had counted on her breaking down, on her begging for her old life back. But she didn't. Instead, she left the comfort of the city without protest, her head held high as she prepared to embark on her new life. The millionaire, who had always been in control, was left to wonder, what was she planning? His daughter's composure unnerved him, but he refused to admit it. Surely, this was all an act. It had to be. As she settled into her new home on the farm, the daughter remained as composed as ever. The farmhouse was small, modest, and nothing like the grand estate she had grown up in. But she didn't seem to mind. She moved through her days with a quiet confidence, learning the rhythms of farm life without complaint. Her husband, though reserved, watched her with growing admiration. He had expected a spoiled city girl, but what he saw was a woman of remarkable strength and adaptability. She worked beside him, her hands dirty from labor, yet her spirit remained untouched. The whispers of curiosity grew louder with each passing week. Those who had expected her to fail now watched with bated breath, wondering what her true intentions were. The mystery of her calm demeanor began to spread, capturing the attention of not only the villagers but even those in the city. Her father, now consumed by his own curiosity, sent his men to watch her from a distance, reporting back to him about her every move. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that his plan had somehow backfired. But the daughter never faltered. In fact, she seemed to grow more at ease with each passing day. Her work on the farm, though hard, gave her a sense of purpose that she had never found in the city. She wasn't living in defeat as her father had hoped, she was thriving. The people around her began to see that this was no act, no facade. Whatever plan she had, if there was one at all, was not about escaping her fate but embracing it. And this baffled everyone, especially the man who had tried to control her life. In the quiet of her new life, the daughter found something that had always eluded her: peace. The frantic pace of the city, the constant pressure to live up to her father's expectations, had disappeared. In its place was the simple rhythm of farm life, where every day was dictated by the sun, the soil, and the seasons. She had been given a life that, by all accounts, should have been a punishment. But instead of feeling trapped, she felt free. The irony was not lost on her, though she kept her thoughts to herself. As the weeks passed, the villagers began to accept her as one of their own. She worked alongside them in the fields, her once delicate hands now calloused from labor. But instead of breaking her, the hard work seemed to strengthen her resolve. Her father's plan to humiliate her had failed spectacularly, though he was still unaware of just how much. The daughter, once a symbol of defiance, had become a symbol of resilience, and this quiet strength was beginning to stir something in the hearts of those who watched her. Yet, beneath the surface of her calm exterior, there was a quiet storm brewing. The daughter's acceptance of her new life was not born out of defeat but out of something far more powerful: determination. She had a plan, though she hadn't shared it with anyone, not even her new husband. The world might see her as a passive participant in her father's scheme, but she knew better. Every day she spent on the farm, every task she took on with grace, was part of a larger game she was playing. And soon, everyone would see it. The marriage, which had been intended as a punishment, had become the foundation for something much greater than anyone could have predicted. The daughter's calm acceptance, her refusal to break, had begun to change the very course of her life. She wasn't simply surviving, she was thriving. And though her father still believed he was in control, the truth was becoming clearer with each passing day: he had underestimated her. The question that now lingered in the air was no longer about how she would survive but what she was planning next. The first days on the farm passed quickly, and to everyone's surprise, the daughter adjusted to her new life with an ease that no one had expected. The quiet rhythm of the countryside, so different from the bustling city, seemed to suit her. She woke with the dawn, her hands quickly learning the tasks of daily farm work. The dirt under her fingernails and the calluses on her hands didn't bother her; in fact, they gave her a sense of satisfaction she had never felt in the opulent halls of her father's mansion. She was adapting, not just surviving. Her husband watched in quiet amazement. He had prepared himself for a spoiled city girl who would refuse the rough, unpolished life of the countryside. Yet, what he saw in her was resilience. She didn't complain, didn't resist. Instead, she embraced the new challenges before her. The chores were hard, the days long, but she worked beside him without hesitation. Her strength, both physical and emotional, took him by surprise. There was no bitterness in her, no sign of the resentment he had expected. She seemed, incredibly, content. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the daughter was not just adjusting, she was thriving. She began to take on more responsibilities, learning the intricacies of the farm, and even offering suggestions for improvements. Her sharp mind, once used to navigating the complexities of high society, now focused on the land. She quickly mastered the rhythms of the seasons, the demands of the crops, and the care of the animals. The people in the village, who had expected her to fail, watched in disbelief as she became an integral part of the community. Her father, however, remained unaware of this transformation. From the city, he continued to believe that his plan was working. He had expected her to beg for mercy by now, to plead for her old life back. But weeks turned into months, and there was no word from her. His men reported back that she was still on the farm, living as a farmer's wife, but they couldn't explain why she seemed so content. The mystery only deepened his frustration. How could she possibly be happy in such a life? The daughter, meanwhile, found a peace in the countryside that she had never known in the city. The wide, open fields, the fresh air, and the simple, honest work gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't realized she was missing. She had always felt trapped in her father's world, where every move was scrutinized, every decision weighed against his expectations. Here, in the vastness of the countryside, she felt free. For the first time in her life, she was truly living for herself, not for anyone else. Her new life wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. The physical labor, the connection to the earth, the sense of purpose, it all grounded her in a way she had never experienced before. She wasn't just surviving the life her father had forced upon her, she was flourishing in it. The farm, which her father had intended as a prison, had become a place of liberation. Each day brought new challenges, but with them came a growing sense of self-reliance and inner strength. She was no longer the rebellious daughter seeking to defy her father. She was becoming something more. Her husband, too, began to see her in a new light. He had married her out of obligation, knowing full well that their union was part of a scheme designed by her father. But as the months passed, he found himself admiring her. Her determination, her intelligence, her ability to adapt to a life so far removed from the one she had known, these were qualities he hadn't expected to find in her. Slowly, respect began to grow between them, forming the foundation of something deeper, something that neither of them had anticipated. Back in the city, the father grew increasingly anxious. His plan had been simple: humble his daughter, break her spirit, and force her to return to him, begging for forgiveness. But that wasn't happening. The reports from the farm were vague, but they suggested that she was doing well, too well. His pride wouldn't allow him to believe it, but a nagging doubt began to creep into his thoughts. Had he miscalculated? He couldn't understand how she could possibly be thriving in a life so far beneath her. As the seasons changed and the farm continued to prosper, the daughter's transformation became impossible to ignore. The people in the village, once skeptical of her ability to adapt, now spoke of her with admiration. She had become a part of their community, working alongside them, sharing in their joys and hardships. The distance between her old life and her new one grew wider with each passing day, and with it, her father's influence over her seemed to fade. She was no longer the daughter he could control. She was becoming something much stronger. The question that now hung in the air was clear: what would her father do when he learned the truth? How would he react when he realized that his plan to punish her had only made her stronger? The quiet life on the farm, which was supposed to be her downfall, had become the very thing that allowed her to flourish. The daughter's journey was far from over, but one thing was certain: she was no longer the same person who had left the city. And as the days passed, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The quiet of the countryside gave her the space to reflect on everything she had been through. The daughter, once accustomed to the luxuries of a wealthy life, found herself experiencing something far more valuable: a sense of purpose. Every day, she rose with the sun, her hands rough from the work, but her heart lighter than it had ever been. She began to understand the beauty and simplicity, the deep satisfaction that came from watching the crops grow, from tending to the animals, and from building something with her own hands. It was a freedom she had never known. With every passing day, the daughter's connection to the land deepened. The wealth and extravagance that had once defined her life now seemed distant, even meaningless. What mattered now was the earth beneath her feet, the cycles of the seasons, and the quiet companionship she found in her new life. There was something profoundly grounding about it all. She no longer felt like the rebellious daughter trying to escape her father's control. She felt like a woman discovering her own strength, her own identity. The transformation was not just physical, but emotional. Her relationship with her husband also began to evolve. At first, they had been strangers, brought together by circumstance, but as time passed, a bond began to form. They worked side by side, sharing the burdens and the rewards of their labor. Though he was a man of few words, she could sense his respect for her growing. He had expected a delicate city girl, someone who would struggle to adapt, but what he found instead was a woman of incredible resilience. Their marriage, once a mere transaction, was becoming something real, built on mutual respect and understanding. The daughter began to see the world through different eyes. The values that had been drilled into her by her father, money, status, power, now seemed hollow. In the fields, under the wide-open sky, she felt truly free. No longer weighed down by her father's expectations, she could breathe, live, and think for herself. She no longer cared about the things that had once seemed so important. The mansion, the parties, the constant pressure to uphold the family name, none of it mattered anymore. Here, she had found a life that was real, one that was hers. Her father's plan, designed to break her, had done the opposite. It had liberated her. She realized that she had spent her entire life living under his shadow, trying to meet his impossible standards. But here, in the simple life of a farm, she had discovered who she truly was. She wasn't just the daughter of a millionaire, she was her own person, capable of shaping her own destiny. The more time she spent on the farm, the more she understood that this was not a punishment, but a gift, a chance to rewrite her story. The inner transformation she experienced was profound. She felt a strength inside her that she had never known before. The challenges of farm life, the hard work, the simplicity of it all, it had stripped away the superficial layers of her former life, revealing her true self. The more she embraced this new reality, the more distant her old life seemed. She no longer cared about her father's approval or his wealth. She had found something far more valuable, her independence, her purpose, and a life filled with meaning. Her thoughts often drifted back to the mansion, but now, they carried no longing, only reflection. The wealth she had once lived among now seemed like a cage. The luxury that had surrounded her had been a distraction, keeping her from seeing what truly mattered. Here, surrounded by the endless sky and the earth beneath her feet, she felt alive. The daughter, once so rebellious and defiant, had found peace not by fighting her fate, but by embracing it. And in that acceptance, she had found her true power. Her transformation was not lost on those around her. The villagers, who had once been skeptical of her ability to adapt, now spoke of her with admiration. She had proven herself, not through words, but through action. She had become a part of their community, working alongside them, sharing in their daily struggles. They no longer saw her as the outsider, the wealthy daughter of a distant millionaire. She was one of them now. The daughter had not only changed her own life, she had changed the way others saw her as well. Even her husband, who had initially viewed her with caution, now looked at her with something close to awe. She had shown him that she was more than just the spoiled girl her father had tried to control. She was strong, capable, and determined. Together, they had built a life that was theirs, one that was far removed from the world of wealth and power her father had once controlled. Their relationship, once forced and awkward, had become a partnership, a union built on shared values and mutual respect. And yet, despite all the peace she had found, there was still a quiet tension that lingered. Her father remained distant, unaware of the transformation his daughter had undergone. She knew that eventually, he would come. And when he did, he would see that the daughter he had tried to break was no longer the same person. She had found something far more powerful than wealth or status. She had found herself. But how would her father react to this newfound strength? That question loomed over her peaceful life, a shadow that would soon bring everything to a head. Back in the city, the millionaire couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at him. Weeks had turned into months, and still, his daughter had not come crawling back to him. His plan, which had seemed flawless, now appeared to be unraveling. The reports from his spies were vague but consistent. She was thriving in the countryside, living her new life with an ease that was baffling. He had expected her to fail, to realize the weight of her mistake and return, humbled. Instead, she was flourishing, and this infuriated him. His pride, so deeply rooted in his sense of control, was deeply wounded. The idea that his daughter could find happiness outside of the life he had built for her was unbearable. He had always believed that money and power were the ultimate measures of success. And yet, here she was, living a simple life on a farm, seemingly more content than she had ever been in the mansion. It made no sense to him. He couldn't understand how she could reject the life he had worked so hard to provide, and worse, how she could thrive without it. The more he thought about it, the more his anger grew. In his mind, this wasn't just about his daughter's rebellion, it was a personal affront. She was defying everything he had taught her, everything he believed in. To him, her happiness in this humble life was a direct challenge to his authority, his values, and his legacy. He couldn't allow it to continue. His ego, bruised and battered, demanded action. He would not stand by and watch his daughter turn her back on everything he had built. Determined to regain control, the millionaire decided to take matters into his own hands. He had already given her enough time to come to her senses, and clearly, she hadn't. It was time to intervene, to remind her who held the real power. In his mind, this wasn't just about saving face, it was about restoring order. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions. And now, his daughter, his own flesh and blood, was defying him in the most public way possible. He couldn't let that stand. He made plans to visit the farm, his heart filled with resentment. His mind was set on one thing, separating her from that life and bringing her back to the city, where she belonged. The thought of her living as a farmer's wife, away from the luxury and status that defined their family, was intolerable. To him, it was a humiliation, a stain on his carefully curated reputation. He could not bear the idea that people might think she had chosen that life over the one he had offered her. His pride simply wouldn't allow it. As he prepared for the journey, his thoughts raced. He imagined how the confrontation would go, how he would arrive at the farm, demand her return, and take her back to the city. In his mind, it was all so simple. She would see reason, realize her mistake, and fall back in line. He would be the one to restore order, to correct this terrible misstep. But deep down, a small voice whispered doubts, questioning whether she would be so easily swayed. He silenced it, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that his daughter had changed. The drive to the countryside felt interminable, each mile stoking the fires of his anger and wounded pride. He envisioned her defiant face, the life she had built without him, and it only fueled his determination. This was about more than just his daughter, it was about his legacy, his authority. If he couldn't control his own family, what did that say about him? His mind twisted the situation into a battle of power, a test of his ability to assert dominance. In his eyes, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. Arriving at the farm, the stark contrast between his polished city life and the rural simplicity was immediate. The air was different here, crisper, quieter, and it unsettled him. He stepped out of his car, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the earth beneath him. The farm, though modest, exuded a sense of vitality, of life and hard work. He hated it. Every part of him recoiled from the idea that his daughter could be content here. And yet, as he approached the house, his anger gave way to something deeper, fear. What if she didn't want to come back? The confrontation he had rehearsed in his mind was suddenly less certain. The daughter who met him at the door was not the girl he had sent away. She was different, stronger, more grounded. She greeted him politely, but there was a quiet confidence in her eyes that unnerved him. This was not the broken, defeated woman he had expected to find. She stood before him, unshaken by his presence, her life on the farm clearly a reflection of her inner peace. The reality of her transformation hit him like a blow. In that moment, the millionaire's pride and power felt small. His daughter, once the symbol of his control, had become the embodiment of everything he couldn't understand: independence, humility, and strength that came from within, not from wealth or status. He had come to reclaim her, to drag her back into the life he had built. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of her happiness, he realized that this confrontation would not go as he had planned. His pride, once the driving force of his life, was on the verge of shattering. The millionaire stood frozen on the threshold of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the scene before him. He had expected to find his daughter living in hardship, struggling to adapt to the harsh realities of rural life. Instead, what he saw was something entirely different. The farm, once a modest and unassuming piece of land, had transformed into a thriving, vibrant estate. The fields were full of healthy crops, the animals well tended, and there was an undeniable sense of life and growth everywhere he looked. The contrast between this and the desolation he had imagined was staggering. His daughter led him through the property, her steps confident and steady. She explained how she and her husband had worked together, building the farm into something not just sustainable, but prosperous. The people from the village had come to rely on them, and they had become an integral part of the community. As she spoke, there was a quiet pride in her voice, a deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had accomplished something meaningful. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, and it was clear that this life had given her a purpose she had never found in the city. The more the millionaire saw, the more his carefully constructed image of his daughter began to crumble. This was not the broken, defeated woman he had expected to find. She was strong, capable, and in control of her own destiny. The farm, which he had intended as a punishment, had become a place of growth and renewal. As he listened to her describe the work they had done, the relationships they had built, he realized that she had found a happiness and fulfillment that all his wealth could never have provided. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. As they reached the heart of the farm, the millionaire's gaze fell on a small group of villagers gathered near the barn. They were laughing, talking, clearly at ease in this place that had become a hub of the community. His daughter greeted them warmly, and they responded with respect and admiration. It was clear that she had earned their trust and their friendship. In that moment, the millionaire understood that his daughter had built something far more valuable than the material wealth he had always prized. She had built a life rich in meaning, connection, and purpose. The weight of this revelation hit him hard. For so long, he had believed that money and power were the only true measures of success. He had dedicated his entire life to accumulating wealth, to building an empire that he believed would bring him control over everything and everyone in his life. But standing here, in the middle of this thriving farm, he realized that his daughter had found something far more valuable than anything he had ever owned. She had found happiness, not in luxury or status, but in the simple, honest work of the land and the relationships she had built. For the first time, the millionaire felt the sting of his own arrogance. He had tried to control his daughter, to force her into a life he thought was best for her, but in doing so, he had failed to see what truly mattered. His pride, once his greatest asset, now felt like a chain around his neck, weighing him down. As he looked at his daughter, he saw not the rebellious girl he had once tried to break, but a woman who had become stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled than he had ever imagined. The realization that he had underestimated her was devastating. His daughter turned to him, her eyes calm and steady, and for the first time, he felt truly vulnerable. He had come here to reclaim her, to drag her back to the city and the life he believed she was meant to lead. But now, standing in the midst of her success, he couldn't bring himself to do it. She had created something real, something meaningful, and it was clear that she had no intention of returning to the world he had tried to impose on her. The power dynamic between them had shifted completely, and he found himself at a loss for words. As the sun began to set over the fields, casting a golden light over the land, the millionaire felt a deep sense of loss. Not for the wealth or the status that his daughter had walked away from, but for the time he had wasted trying to control her, for the love he had failed to give. He had spent so many years trying to mold her into someone she wasn't, and in doing so, he had pushed her away. Now, as he stood in the midst of her new life, he realized that the daughter he had tried to control was gone, replaced by a woman who had built a life of her own. In that moment, the millionaire knew that he had lost. Not in the way he had imagined. He hadn't been defeated by an enemy or by circumstance. He had been defeated by his own pride, by his refusal to see his daughter for who she truly was. She had won, not by fighting him, but by finding her own path and walking it with grace and strength. The realization was both humbling and painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time, he understood that his daughter didn't need him to succeed. She had found her own way, and it was a path he could never have predicted. As the evening light faded, the millionaire turned to his daughter, his voice soft with the weight of his revelation. "I didn't realize. I didn't understand." She smiled at him, a gentle, knowing smile that spoke of forgiveness and understanding. "I know, Father," she replied quietly. "But now you do." In that moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, not because she had bent to his will, but because he had finally seen her for who she truly was. It was a moment of quiet reconciliation, a turning point in their relationship, and the beginning of a new understanding. The drive back to the city was long, but for the first time in his life, the millionaire found himself lost in thought. His mind, usually so sharp and focused on business, now swirled with questions he had never considered. The revelation he had experienced on the farm weighed heavily on him, forcing him to confront the truth about himself and the life he had built. His daughter had shown him a strength he hadn't believed she possessed, and in doing so, she had exposed the deep flaws in his own character. His pride, once his greatest asset, now felt like a burden. As the city skyline came into view, the millionaire realized just how much his perspective had shifted. The towering buildings, the opulence, the symbols of power and wealth that had once filled him with pride, now seemed hollow. He had spent his entire life building an empire, believing that control and success were all that mattered. But what had it brought him? A broken relationship with his daughter, a life defined by isolation and dominance, and a heart burdened by the weight of expectations he had imposed on himself and others. For the first time, he questioned the path he had chosen. In the quiet of his car, he thought about the life his daughter had built, so different from the one he had envisioned for her. The simplicity of the farm, the hard work, the community, it was a world he had always looked down upon, but now, he couldn't help but admire it. She had found something that he had never been able to grasp: contentment. While he had spent his life chasing after more money, more power, more control, she had found peace in less. The irony was not lost on him, and it stung more than he cared to admit. By the time he reached his estate, the millionaire felt like a different man. The grand halls, the lavish furniture, the cold perfection of his mansion, all of it seemed foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else. He walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the emptiness that had always surrounded him. His wealth had given him control, but it had also isolated him from the things that truly mattered. And now, faced with the truth of his daughter's happiness, he realized how much he had lost. Days passed, and the millionaire found himself reflecting on his life in ways he never had before. His interactions with others felt different, more distant, as if the veil of arrogance that had once clouded his view of the world was slowly lifting. He saw people not as assets or tools to be controlled, but as individuals with their own lives, their own struggles, and their own desires. His daughter's strength had opened his eyes to the possibility that there was more to life than the pursuit of power. For the first time, he began to question the values that had driven him for so long. One afternoon, as he sat in his study, the millionaire found himself reaching for the phone. His fingers hovered over the numbers, but he hesitated. What would he say? How could he begin to repair the damage that had been done? He had spent so many years controlling, dictating, and demanding that he didn't know how to simply be a father. But the image of his daughter's calm smile, her quiet strength, pushed him forward. He dialed her number, his heart pounding in his chest. When she answered, her voice was warm, inviting. "Hello, Father." Their conversation was brief, but meaningful. He didn't apologize outright, he didn't yet know how, but the tone of his voice, the softness in his words, conveyed what his pride wouldn't let him say. She listened, understanding the unspoken apology in his hesitation. Their relationship, once fractured by his need for control, was beginning to heal. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he was willing to let go of his expectations and allow her to live her life on her terms. It was a small step, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, the millionaire found himself drawn back to the farm, not physically, but in his thoughts. The memory of his daughter's transformation, her resilience, and the life she had built without him lingered in his mind. He realized that in trying to control her, he had been blind to the strength she had always possessed. Now, as he reflected on her choices, he saw her not as the rebellious daughter he had tried to subdue, but as a woman who had found her own path, her own happiness. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace with that. the millionaire began to change in small but significant ways. He loosened his grip on the reins of his business, delegating more, trusting others to make decisions. He started to reach out to people he had once seen only as tools for his success, reconnecting with old friends, making amends where he could. The man who had once been driven by pride and control was slowly giving way to someone more reflective, more willing to listen. It wasn't an easy transformation. His old habits ran deep, but the seeds of change had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. One day, as he stood by the window of his mansion, looking out over the city, the millionaire smiled. It was a small, private smile, one that spoke of quiet understanding. He knew that he still had a long way to go, that his relationship with his daughter was still fragile, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't in control anymore, and that was okay. His daughter had taught him something he had never expected to learn, that true strength comes not from power or wealth, but from the ability to let go. As time passed, the millionaire's transformation became more profound, but it was the quiet, reflective kind of change. He had spent years chasing after wealth and control, believing that power was the ultimate measure of success. Yet, in his daughter's simple, contented life, he had seen a truth that had eluded him all those years. True happiness couldn't be bought, and real success wasn't about dominance or wealth. It was about love, humility, and the connections one built with others. This revelation shifted his entire perspective, leaving him humbled. The bond between father and daughter, once so fragile and strained, slowly mended. The daughter no longer needed her father's approval, and the father had learned to let go of his need to control her. Their relationship, no longer defined by power and pride, began to take on new depth, built on mutual respect and understanding. The millionaire, once convinced that he knew what was best for her, now saw her for who she truly was, a woman who had found her own way, on her own terms. It was a lesson he had never expected to learn, but one that changed him forever. The greatest irony of his life was that the very plan he had devised to punish her had instead liberated her, and in doing so, had freed him as well. He had tried to control her through force, to bend her to his will, but in the end, it was her quiet strength that had prevailed. In her resilience, he had discovered his own weakness, and in her happiness, he had found his own peace. The wealth and power he had spent his life accumulating now felt like mere illusions compared to the deep, abiding joy he saw in his daughter's eyes. The farm had become a symbol of everything he had once dismissed. It wasn't grand, it wasn't luxurious, but it was rich in ways that his wealth had never been. The simple, honest life his daughter had built was full of meaning, and in it, he saw the truth that had evaded him for so long. The father, once blinded by his own arrogance, now understood that success wasn't about what one owned or controlled, but about the love one shared and the lives one touched. His daughter had shown him the true measure of wealth, and it had nothing to do with money. In the end, the millionaire's heart softened in ways he never thought possible. He had spent his life in pursuit of more money, more power, more control, but now, he found himself content with less. The distance between him and his daughter, both physical and emotional, had closed. They didn't need to speak of forgiveness or the past, it was understood in the way they now shared their lives, in the way they looked at each other with respect and affection. The walls that had once stood between them had crumbled, replaced by a bond far stronger than either of them had imagined. There were moments when the father would visit the farm, standing silently by the fields, watching his daughter work alongside her husband. The sight of her, so at peace with herself and her life, filled him with a quiet pride, not the kind of pride that came from ownership or control, but the pride of seeing someone you love truly happy. He no longer felt the need to intervene, to guide or direct her. She had found her path, and in doing so, she had helped him find his. The simplicity of it all, once so foreign to him, now felt like the ultimate wisdom. In the solitude of his own thoughts, the millionaire often reflected on the journey he and his daughter had taken. It wasn't an easy one, but it had been necessary. He had learned that letting go of control was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It had taken him a lifetime to understand that love, not power, was the true measure of success. His daughter's courage had taught him that humility was more valuable than any amount of money, and that freedom came not from controlling others, but from allowing them to live their own lives. As the years went by, the father found himself less concerned with his business empire, more focused on the people around him. The relationships he had once taken for granted became his priority, and he worked to rebuild them, just as he had with his daughter. The wisdom he had gained from watching her live her life had seeped into every part of his own. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to anyone, nor did he feel the pressure to maintain the image of the all-powerful millionaire. He was finally at peace with who he was. In the end, the story wasn't just about the daughter's transformation, it was about the father's as well. Through her quiet defiance and resilience, she had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that true wealth is found in love, humility, and the freedom to be oneself. The father, once a man of immense pride, had learned the value of letting go, of allowing those he loved to live their own lives. And in doing so, he had found the one thing he had always been searching for, but had never understood: peace. Before you leave, don't miss out on the next incredible story waiting for you. You've just witnessed a powerful transformation of love, humility, and personal growth, but what if I told you there's more? The next video on your screen holds another emotional journey filled with unexpected twists, deep revelations, and life-changing moments. Curiosity piqued? Go ahead, click on it now and dive into another unforgettable experience. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on these moving stories. Your thoughts matter, so feel free to drop a comment below and share what you love most about today's story. Let's keep the conversation going.